Everyone ignored the German shepherd's howls. Seconds later, nobody could believe their eyes. What you're about to hear will break your heart and then heal it. It's a moment of loyalty, love, and courage that even time cannot erase. Share with us, what word comes to your mind when you think of dogs? Like, share, and subscribe to honor these bonds of love. The evening had settled quietly over the small town. The kind of evening where the streets looked calm and ordinary, with dim lamps glowing faintly and windows slowly darkening as families turned in for the night. The sound of distant crickets mixed with the rustle of dry leaves. Everything seemed at peace, like the town had wrapped itself in silence. But that silence was suddenly broken by a sound so piercing that it carried through every street, the howl of a German shepherd. At first, people paid little attention. Dogs howled sometimes, after all. Some thought it was just a stray, maybe hungry or lost. Curtains shifted in the houses nearby as tired faces peeked out, frowning at the noise. A few muttered complaints. "It's nothing, just a dog making trouble again," someone whispered before shutting their window. But the dog's voice did not fade. It grew louder, filled with something deeper than hunger or restlessness. The German shepherd stood tall at the corner of the street, his body stiff, his ears sharp. His howl wasn't ordinary. It echoed with urgency, a sound that carried warning. His eyes were locked on one dark alley, refusing to look anywhere else. Every few seconds he lowered his voice to a deep growl, circling, pacing, then lifting his head again to howl into the night. It was a cry that refused to be ignored. Children pressed their faces against the glass of their bedroom windows, uneasy without knowing why. Parents hushed them, saying, "It's just a dog, nothing more." But in their own hearts, some of the grown-ups felt something strange too. There was weight in that sound, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. Still, the townsfolk turned away. Some covered their ears. Some laughed nervously, calling the shepherd mad. But the dog did not stop. He barked, howled, circled, and then planted himself firmly at the edge of the alley, his paws digging into the ground as if warning everyone that something was hidden there. His chest heaved with each breath, his eyes shone in the dim glow of the street lamps, and his whole body trembled, not with fear, but with determination. Minutes dragged on. The sound cut through the stillness again and again, until it was impossible to ignore. The air itself seemed heavier, like the night was holding its breath. A few neighbors stepped outside, pulling their coats tight against the cold. They whispered among themselves, irritation mixing with unease. Why was the dog howling like this? What did he see in that alley that they could not? The German shepherd did not waver. He stood guard, muscles tense, tail stiff, his gaze locked into the shadows. He pawed at the ground and released another long, broken howl, the kind that chills the spine and makes even the bravest man's heart pound harder. What no one realized was that those howls were not cries of madness, nor noise to be brushed aside. They were warnings, desperate calls meant to draw attention to something hidden just beyond their sight. And seconds later, when the truth finally came to light, every single person in that quiet town would find themselves frozen in disbelief. Because what the German shepherd had sensed, what he had been trying to tell them all along, was something that no one could have ever imagined. The town lay wrapped in its usual stillness as dusk crept in. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, their yellow glow falling across cobblestone paths that had grown familiar to every soul who lived there. Small shops stood in a quiet row along the main street, their wooden signs swaying gently in the evening breeze. The bakery closed its shutters after selling the last loaf, and the old tailor locked his door, carrying a lantern to guide his way home. By the riverbank, a lone fisherman gathered his nets, humming an old tune that blended into the soft hush of the night. Life here always moved slowly, like a clock that ticked just a little behind the world outside. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children played on porches until their mothers called them in. The sound of crickets filled the spaces between conversations, and the smell of firewood lingered in the air as chimneys began to puff smoke. There was comfort in this quiet, a sense that nothing unexpected could ever break through the town's gentle rhythm. But as often happens in places where life feels too steady, rumors lived beneath the calm. People spoke in hushed voices about things dogs could sense, things beyond human sight or sound. Some swore they had seen their animals grow tense when no one was around, staring into empty fields as if they spotted ghosts. Others claimed dogs barked at shadows that carried no shape. "They know," an old woman often said, tapping her cane for emphasis. "They see what we cannot. Dogs are closer to the unseen than we are." Most laughed it off, calling it superstition, though deep down even the skeptics remembered moments when their pets acted strangely, moments they could never explain. On this evening, as the lamps glowed faintly against the gathering mist, a little girl in a blue dress walked hand in hand with her loyal German shepherd. Her small shoes tapped softly against the road, the sound almost lost beneath the hush of the night. She hummed a broken tune her grandmother had sung earlier, her voice sweet but faint, like a secret carried in the air. The shepherd padded beside her, his dark fur glistening faintly under the lamplight. His ears twitched at every sound, the rattle of a loose shutter, the creak of a wagon wheel rolling home, the distant call of an owl. The girl trusted him more than anything else in her small world. To her, he was not just a dog. He was her guardian, her playmate, her shadow. He chased away her fears with the wag of his tail and protected her dreams with the warmth of his body curled close at night. Every villager knew the sight of the girl in her blue dress walking with her shepherd, and many smiled as they passed, believing it was one of the town's tenderest scenes. But that evening, something shifted. Just as they reached the bend where the road dipped into a quieter street lined with aging houses, the shepherd stopped. His entire body froze in place, his paws stiff against the ground. The little girl tugged his leash gently, thinking he had simply grown distracted, but he did not budge. His ears were rigid now, his nose lifted slightly as he sniffed the damp night air. His muscles trembled as though every fiber of his being had tightened in alarm. The girl frowned, her small fingers curling tighter around his fur. She looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart skip. His gaze wasn't soft or playful anymore. It was locked, sharp, filled with a strange warning she could not understand. He let out a low, rumbling growl, not loud, but enough to send a shiver through the evening air. Somewhere nearby, a lantern flickered as if responding to the sound. The street grew even quieter, almost unnaturally so, as if the entire town had paused to listen. The girl glanced around but saw nothing unusual, just the empty road, the mist curling against the stone walls, and the faint outlines of houses where windows were closing for the night. But her shepherd refused to move. His eyes remained fixed on the shadows ahead, his body tense and ready, his growl now steady and deeper. The girl whispered his name, her voice uncertain, but he did not turn. She had heard the old rumors too, the ones about dogs knowing things, sensing danger before it arrived. For the first time in her young life, she wondered if the whispers might be true. She clung to his side, not pulling him forward anymore, but waiting. The warmth of his fur gave her courage, even as her small heart thudded faster in her chest. The shepherd stepped forward at last, slow and cautious, his nose close to the ground, his eyes burning with focus. The girl followed, her tiny steps careful, her blue dress brushing against the damp air. The town remained still, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the beginning of something waiting to be revealed. That night, in the quiet streets of a town that believed itself safe from surprises, the German shepherd sensed what no one else could. And in the seconds that followed, he would prove to them all that some instincts are never wrong, no matter how much humans choose to ignore them. The German Shepherd's body stiffened even more, his stance unshakable as he stared into the stretch of darkness ahead. His ears stood tall, twitching at every whisper of the night air, while his tail sank low, sweeping cautiously across the ground. Then, without warning, he let out a deep, aching howl. It wasn't the casual bark of a dog calling attention, nor the playful sound he used when chasing after children in the fields. This was something else, a cry that trembled through the stillness, raw and haunting, carrying a message no one yet understood. The little girl clutched at his thick fur, her small hands burying themselves into the warmth of his coat. Her bright blue dress swayed in the night breeze as she pressed herself against him, her wide eyes fixed on his strange behavior. She didn't understand why her beloved companion was suddenly acting so restless. Only minutes ago, they had been walking home peacefully, her humming filling the air, but now his growls vibrated like thunder in her chest. She didn't know the reason, but she knew enough to trust him. The shepherd circled, paws scraping the earth, his nose close to the ground, then snapping up again as he barked into the unseen. Each movement was sharp and deliberate, the actions of a creature pulled between fear and duty. His chest rose and fell heavily, each breath filled with urgency. He pawed at the ground, claws digging at the damp soil near the road's edge, as though something buried beneath the surface demanded to be uncovered. The girl tugged lightly at his side, whispering his name, her voice soft and uncertain. But he did not answer her call. His world was locked onto something she could not see. The sound of his howls carried down the quiet street, bouncing off the stone walls of the old houses. Lights flicked on one by one as neighbors grew restless. Curtains parted, tired faces peeking out. Some muttered under their breath, annoyed by the disruption. "What is that animal doing?" one man grumbled, leaning out of his window. Another woman, arms crossed over her shawl, hissed, "It's late. Why won't he stop making such a scene?" But others, though irritated, could not look away. The howl was too strange, too heavy with meaning. It wasn't the reckless noise of a stray scavenging for scraps. It was the cry of an animal who knew something was wrong. A few gathered closer, drawn out of their homes by the sheer persistence of the shepherd's voice. They stood at the edges of the road, watching as he circled again, lowering his chest close to the ground, his eyes sharp as knives in the lamplight. The baby girl turned her gaze toward the people gathering, her face marked with confusion. She didn't have the words to explain what was happening, but she held her shepherd tighter, as if afraid someone might pull him away before he revealed what troubled him so deeply. Her lips trembled, though no tears fell. She was too young to understand the weight of the moment, but old enough to know that her dog was never wrong. The murmurs grew louder as more neighbors stepped out, pulling on coats or carrying lanterns. Some shook their heads, whispering, "It's just a dog. Let him be." But their voices carried unease, for the truth was plain in the shepherd's eyes. This was no ordinary outburst. Each bark came sharper, echoing with urgency, as if he was begging for them to listen. Fear began to mingle with their curiosity. A group of children huddled close to their grandmother, staring with wide, anxious eyes. A farmer wiped his brow nervously, muttering something about animals sensing things before humans ever could. And though no one wanted to say it out loud, the thought had already passed through many minds. What if the dog was warning them of danger? Still, the tension pulled in both directions. Some wanted to chase the shepherd away, frustrated by the noise, eager to restore the evening's peace. Others wanted to wait, to see where his instincts might lead. But no one could deny that his distress was contagious. The air felt heavier, the mist thicker, as though the night itself leaned in to listen to his cries. The German shepherd ignored the divided voices around him. His loyalty, his focus, his instinct, it all pointed toward one thing hidden in the shadows. He lowered himself suddenly, growling so deeply that the ground seemed to vibrate beneath his paws. His eyes glowed with intensity in the dim light, and another howl tore from his throat, carrying high into the night air. The little girl held tighter still, pressing her cheek against his back. Her tiny frame shook not just from fear, but from the unspoken knowledge that something was near, something that her friend was trying to protect her from. She didn't see it, but she felt it. And through her dog's trembling body, she knew it was real. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity pushing against their fear. No longer could they dismiss the shepherd as a nuisance. His persistence, his refusal to move, and his mournful howls demanded attention. Whatever secret the night held, he had already sensed it. And soon enough, they would be forced to see it too. The German shepherd's cries had stretched long into the night, refusing to fade. What had begun as irritation soon became a summons no one could ignore. One by one, more people emerged from their homes, lanterns in hand, coats wrapped tight against the cool night breeze. The street that had been so quiet only moments ago now held clusters of townsfolk, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel as they drew nearer to the restless dog. The first to step forward was a farmer named Thomas, his boots heavy with the dust of the day's work. He carried a lantern high, the warm glow flickering across his weathered face. He squinted at the dog, his jaw tightening. "Animals know things we don't," he muttered under his breath. Years ago, one of his old farm dogs had barked endlessly at the barn door, and when Thomas finally went to check, he found smoke curling from the rafters. That dog had saved his livelihood, and maybe his life. The memory tightened in his chest as he watched the shepherd paw desperately at the ground. Beside him walked Clara, the town schoolteacher, her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders. She frowned at the sight, her brows knitting with both concern and curiosity. She remembered stories she'd read, old folk tales about animals crying before storms or before sickness struck. Once, long ago, she had ignored the warning signs of her family's own shepherd when he had howled for hours. The next morning, their chicken coop had been raided by foxes. "I've learned never to laugh at a dog's warning," she whispered, almost to herself. An elderly grandmother shuffled closer, her cane tapping softly against the stones. Her face carried the weight of decades of memories, both tender and painful. She looked at the shepherd with eyes that shimmered under the lantern light. She remembered a night many years past, when her husband had been late returning home from the mines. Their own hound had barked and cried at the doorway, refusing to settle. Hours later, news came that a collapse had taken several lives underground. Her husband had survived, but she never forgot the way the dog had sensed disaster before anyone else. Her heart ached at the sound of the shepherd's howls, for it was too familiar. Soon after came Officer Daniels, the town's local policeman. He stood tall, his cap tilted low, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist. He had seen plenty of nights filled with strange noises and restless animals, but even he felt uneasy at the dog's behavior. Years of training told him to trust patterns, to follow instincts. And he knew well that a trained German shepherd rarely made noise without cause. He placed a hand on his belt, frowning. "Something's not right," he said firmly, though no one asked. The shepherd remained at the edge of the alley, unmoving. His body was locked, his muscles tense, his paws digging grooves into the dirt. A neighbor tried tossing him a piece of bread, hoping to distract him, but the dog didn't so much as glance at it. He refused to eat, refused to move, refused to calm. His gaze was pinned on the darkness ahead as if it held the answer to a question only he understood. His growls rumbled low, rising now and then into another howl that echoed against the buildings. The baby girl stood at his side, her blue dress brushing against the lantern light. She pressed her small hands against the shepherd's neck, whispering to him softly, but even her gentle voice could not soothe him. She felt his body tremble, not from fear, but from urgency. Though she was too young to understand, she clung to him, refusing to let go, as if she somehow knew that whatever he was guarding against was more important than anyone yet realized. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Some whispered in fear, others in disbelief. "Why does he keep staring like that?" someone asked, their voice breaking. "Maybe it's nothing, maybe he's just spooked," another replied quickly, though their eyes darted nervously toward the alley. An older man shook his head, muttering, "Dogs don't howl like that unless they know something's there." The air thickened with unease. The lanterns flickered against the walls, shadows stretching like long fingers across the cobblestones. Every rustle of the wind in the trees made people flinch. The night, once peaceful, now felt sharp with tension. Whispers rose louder, circling among the crowd. Should they investigate? Or was it better to leave whatever troubled the dog hidden in the dark? One woman clutched her child close, insisting, "We shouldn't disturb it. Nothing good ever comes from chasing shadows." Yet another, braver, leaned forward and said, "If he's warning us, we can't just stand here. What if someone needs help?" The debate sparked back and forth, fear against courage, doubt against trust. And all the while, the shepherd did not move. His loyalty to the unseen, his refusal to leave his post, seemed to demand an answer from the people gathered around him. The baby girl finally looked up at the faces around her, her voice small but clear. "He's trying to tell us something." The words struck the crowd like a quiet bell. For a moment, no one spoke, all eyes shifting back to the dog, who stood firm, a living statue of determination. The murmurs died into silence, replaced by the steady sound of the shepherd's growl and the faint rustle of wind through the alley. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with expectation. Something waited in the darkness. Something the dog knew but no human had yet seen. And now, the townsfolk had to decide, would they trust the shepherd's instincts and step into the shadows, or would they walk away and forever wonder what they had ignored? The murmurs of the townsfolk swelled until finally, a few of the braver men stepped forward. They carried lanterns and old flashlights, the beams cutting thin streaks of light through the heavy mist. The dog's howls had become impossible to ignore, and his body language was too sharp, too urgent, to dismiss as ordinary restlessness. With a determined glance at one another, the men nodded and began to move toward the alley where the shepherd's gaze had never wavered. The alley had long been a place people avoided. Wedged between two crumbling brick buildings, it was narrow and damp, hidden from the comfort of the main road. The walls were streaked with moss and mildew, and rusted pipes clung to the sides like the bones of forgotten machinery. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, each drop echoing like a clock ticking too loud in a silent room. The air grew colder as the group stepped inside, the lantern light trembling against the wet walls. The shepherd led the way, his body tense, every step measured. His nails clicked against the cobblestones as he paced forward, tail low, ears pinned, his nose working the air with feverish intensity. Every few steps he stopped, releasing a sharp bark that rang against the walls, his chest heaving with urgency. The little girl trailed just behind him, her hand resting on his back as though she drew her courage from his strength. Behind them followed the farmer, the teacher, the grandmother, and Officer Daniels, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Feels like walking into a grave," the teacher whispered, her voice trembling. The farmer grunted in reply, lifting his lantern higher, but even the flame seemed reluctant to stretch far into the shadows. The dog stopped suddenly. His entire body stiffened, his nose pressed close to the ground near a gate at the alley's far end. It was old, its iron frame corroded and streaked with rust, the lock heavy and still intact despite years of neglect. The shepherd growled deep in his chest, a sound that made the hairs on the back of every neck rise. Then he barked furiously, throwing his paws against the gate with a force that rattled its hinges. The sharp clang echoed through the narrow passage like a warning bell. The baby girl tightened her grip on his fur, her small face pale in the lantern glow. "Why is he so scared?" she asked softly, though no one had an answer. The grandmother reached out to steady the child, her wrinkled hand trembling as it touched her shoulder. The townsfolk crowded closer, their unease growing heavier with each passing second. "What's back there?" one man whispered. No one replied, but all eyes fixed on the locked gate as if it might speak for itself. The shepherd would not relent. He pawed and barked, his claws screeching against the iron, his growl tearing through the silence like thunder. His urgency infected the crowd. They looked at one another, breaths short, hearts pounding. "He wants us to open it," the farmer said finally, his voice low but certain. "Something's behind that gate." Officer Daniel stepped forward, flashlight beam landing on the rusty lock. It was thick, but time had corroded it. He shook his head grimly. "It hasn't been opened in years. Whatever's behind it, it's been hidden a long time." His words sent a ripple of unease through the people, but also a strange pull of curiosity. The teacher hugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe we shouldn't. Some doors are sealed for a reason." Her words hung heavy, echoing old town warnings about places better left untouched. But the shepherd's furious barks broke through her hesitation, demanding action. The farmer, unwilling to wait, stepped forward with determination. "We can't ignore him. Not after the way he's carried on." He signaled to two other men, and soon they returned with tools: an iron crowbar, an old hammer, and a heavy lantern that they set on the ground near the gate. The air thickened as they readied themselves. The crowd stood in silence, watching, waiting, the faint dripping of water the only sound besides the shepherd's relentless growls. The little girl's wide eyes shimmered with fear, but she never let go of her dog's back, her small figure pressed close against his trembling body. The farmer wedged the crowbar into the lock, straining against the years of rust. The sound of metal grinding echoed through the alley, sharp and jarring. Sparks flew as another man swung the hammer, striking at the corroded frame. The gate groaned, the hinges rattling, dust and flakes of rust raining down with every strike. The shepherd barked louder, throwing himself against the gate as if urging them on. His chest thumped, his eyes blazed with a light that sent shivers through every onlooker. He seemed to know, whatever lay beyond this barrier, it was important, it was urgent, and it could not remain hidden. The grandmother whispered a prayer under her breath, her cane tapping nervously against the stones. The teacher clasped her hands together, torn between fear and hope. Officer Daniels leaned closer, his flashlight steady, his jaw tight. "Almost there," the farmer grunted, sweat streaking his brow despite the cold. With one final crack, the lock gave way. The iron snapped, the sound echoing down the alley like the final toll of a bell. The gate creaked, groaned, and slowly swung open, its hinges screaming in protest. A rush of damp air spilled out, carrying with it a smell so strange and heavy that everyone instinctively stepped back. The shepherd, however, lunged forward, his growl deepening into a howl that shook the air. His paws dug against the ground, his body pulling toward the darkness revealed beyond the gate. The crowd held its breath, their eyes locked on the opening. They knew there was no turning back. Whatever secret the German shepherd had unearthed tonight was waiting just beyond that threshold, and soon every one of them would be forced to face it. The gate gave way at last, the rusty hinges screaming in protest as the iron frames swung open. A rush of foul, stagnant air spilled out into the alley, so heavy that several people covered their mouths and noses instinctively. The smell was sharp, damp, and sour, as though it had been trapped for decades, waiting for the night it would finally escape. Lantern flames flickered wildly, fighting against the sudden gust of air. For a moment, no one moved. The darkness beyond the gate stretched out like an open mouth, black and bottomless, daring someone to step inside. The shepherd broke that silence. With a low growl rumbling in his chest, he pressed forward, hackles raised, his entire body trembling with focus. He was no longer simply alert. He was determined. His paws crossed the threshold first, claws scratching against the stone floor inside. The little girl gasped but clung tightly to the fur along his back, trusting him more than the voices of hesitation circling in the crowd. Lanterns and flashlights lifted higher, casting weak beams across the hidden space. Slowly, the shapes inside began to emerge. It wasn't just an alley, it was an underground storage room buried behind the locked gate. The floor was uneven stone, slick with moisture. Patches of moss clung to the walls, and above, wooden beams sagged as though weary from years of holding the weight of silence. The place carried the feeling of a forgotten cellar, a space left behind by time itself. As the lantern light fell deeper into the gloom, scattered objects appeared. A torn blanket lay crumpled in the corner, stiff and discolored, its edges gnawed as if something had clawed at it. Nearby, a pair of old shoes sat abandoned, their leather cracked, one half buried in the damp soil. Strange marks scarred the floor, scratches, long and jagged, etched deep into the stone. Some were curved, others straight, but all carried the same desperate energy, as though they had been carved by frantic hands or claws struggling against confinement. The townsfolk whispered uneasily, their voices thin in the cold air. "Who would leave this here?" one muttered. Another shook his head, his face pale in the lantern light. "This place should not exist." The shepherd moved deeper, ignoring the murmurs, his nose twitching rapidly as he scanned the shadows. Every step he took was sharp and precise, his muscles taut as though expecting something to leap out from the corners. His growls rose and fell, soft but constant, a steady reminder that the danger, or the truth, was still near. The little girl followed as far as she could, but the grandmother caught her arm gently, whispering, "Stay close, child." The beam of Officer Daniel's flashlight swept across the far wall, catching the glint of metal. Everyone's eyes turned instantly to the spot. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a rusted pipe, but then came the sound, faint, chilling, metallic. It echoed once, then again, as though something deep inside the storage had shifted ever so slightly. The noise was hollow, dragging, like the scrape of iron against stone. The crowd stiffened. A few gasped. The farmer lowered his lantern, his knuckles white as he gripped its handle. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The shepherd's ears shot up. His growl grew sharper, echoing in the cramped chamber. His eyes locked onto the far corner, where the light barely reached. He crouched low, ready to spring, his tail stiff and his body a perfect line of tension. No one breathed. The foul air pressed heavier around them, thick and suffocating. The strange marks on the floor suddenly seemed less like scratches from time and more like signs of a struggle. The torn blanket, the old shoes, the abandoned objects, all of them felt like fragments of a story left unfinished. And now the metallic sound seemed to confirm it. The story wasn't over. The teacher clutched her shawl tighter, whispering, "This place, it feels wrong." But the grandmother, her eyes fixed on the shepherd, murmured, "No. It feels like it has been waiting to be found." Another metallic scrape echoed, louder this time. It carried through the chamber, bouncing off the stone walls, until it seemed to crawl beneath everyone's skin. Some stepped back, unable to bear it. Others leaned forward, their fear tangled with unbearable curiosity. The shepherd barked furiously, his voice exploding in the confined space, bouncing in sharp echoes that made the lantern flames tremble. His hackles stood like bristles, his chest heaved, and his eyes blazed with certainty. He pawed the ground and lunged a step forward, forcing the men behind him to raise their tools in nervous defense. But he wasn't attacking them, he was warning them. Something inside that space demanded their attention, and he would not let them turn away. The little girl cried out softly, her voice small but full of trust. "He's telling us, listen to him." She clutched the grandmother's hand now, her eyes wide and frightened, but her faith in her dog never faltered. The metallic sound came again, a dragging clank followed by silence so thick it seemed to hum in everyone's ears. The crowd stared into the darkness beyond the reach of their lights, their breaths short and shallow. The shepherd held his ground, his growls steady, his entire body a wall of defiance between the people and the shadows. The farmer raised his crowbar, the teacher whispered another prayer, Officer Daniels steadied his flashlight, and together they inched closer. Every step was cautious, every heart beating like a drum. The foul air thickened, the shadows seemed to press in tighter, and the metallic sound, whatever it was, waited. The hidden space had revealed itself, but it was only the beginning. Something was still inside, something that made even the bravest among them hesitate. And though fear clung to every soul gathered in that dark chamber, they all knew one thing with certainty. The shepherd would not have led them here without reason. And whatever that reason was, they were about to face it. The foul air lingered, clinging to every breath as the townsfolk stared into the hidden space. Their lanterns wavered, weak against the heaviness of the dark. The shepherd remained in front, growling low, his body refusing to yield. His gaze was fixed not only on the shadows but also on the objects scattered across the damp floor. And then someone noticed the shoes. They lay half buried in the dust, worn and cracked from years of neglect. The leather was faded, the laces frayed, but the size was unmistakable. Too small for any adult, too fragile to belong to a worker. They were a child's shoes. The grandmother's cane tapped once against the stones as her lips parted in disbelief. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her frail body leaned forward, her eyes straining in the dim light. "I know those shoes." The crowd turned toward her, their faces pale, waiting for her to continue. Her words cracked like brittle wood. "They belonged to Matthew, the boy who went missing so many years ago." Gasps rippled through the group. Some stepped back, clutching their coats tighter as if the chill had seeped into their bones. Others froze, their eyes wide, recalling the same story that had haunted the town for decades. Matthew, the boy who never came home. The schoolteacher covered her mouth with her hand. She remembered the boy well. He had sat in her classroom once, full of energy, his laughter ringing in the halls. She remembered the day he vanished, the frantic search parties, the weeping parents begging for answers. She remembered how the entire town combed the fields, the riverbanks, the alleys, but found nothing. The mystery had become a wound that never healed, a scar that lingered in silence. The farmer lowered his lantern, the light trembling in his hand. He too remembered. He had been younger then, strong and eager, part of the men who searched through the forest night after night. He had returned home empty-handed, shame burning in his chest for not finding even a trace. He still saw the boy's mother standing at her doorstep, her eyes hollow with grief, calling her son's name into the night until her voice broke. The grandmother's eyes watered, her voice cracking. Those were his shoes. I'd know them anywhere. His mother had saved every coin to buy them. They were his pride, his joy. He never took them off. Her hand shook as she pointed toward the dusty corner. And here they are, in this place. The weight of her words pressed down on everyone. The air thickened, heavy with memories and sorrow. Faces turned pale, eyes glistened as the townsfolk exchanged knowing glances. Whispers rose like a tide, stories resurfacing, grief long buried clawing back to the surface. "I remember the search," one man muttered. "We thought he fell into the river. We thought maybe he ran away." "But the dog," another whispered, glancing toward the shepherd. "The dog found him, or what's left of him." The baby girl clutched her shepherd tightly, sensing the sorrow around her though she didn't fully understand. Her eyes flicked from the dog's steady stance to the trembling faces of the adults. She whispered softly, "He wanted us to know." The shepherd growled once more, a sound that carried not anger but mourning. He stepped forward, pawing gently at the old shoes, then pressing his nose against them. The sight made the grandmother sob quietly, her cane shaking as she leaned on it. The sound of her grief broke something in the crowd, pulling long-forgotten tears into the open. Officer Daniel straightened, his jaw tight, his flashlight beam steady on the corner of the chamber. His voice was low, rough with tension. "This isn't just an old cellar. It's a grave of secrets. Someone hid this." The teacher's eyes brimmed with tears. She recalled the way Matthew's mother would stand at the cemetery gates every Sunday, waiting as though her boy might return. Rain or shine, she never missed a day, her face etched with sorrow. She always said she felt he was close. "Maybe she wasn't wrong," she whispered. The metallic clank from deeper in the chamber echoed again, and the shepherd barked sharply, pulling everyone back from their memories. But the weight of realization had already settled. This was no accident, no forgotten space. The objects, the blanket, the shoes, the scratches etched into stone, all told a story. A dark one. A story of a child who vanished and of a truth buried beneath silence. Fear rippled through the crowd. Some wanted to leave, to seal the gate once more and forget what they had seen. But others felt the pull of justice, of closure. The grandmother spoke again, her voice shaking but firm. "This dog has shown us what we turned away from. We cannot ignore it now. Matthew's story, the story of others, it lies here." The little girl pressed her cheek against her shepherd's back, whispering as if to herself, "He didn't want to be forgotten." And in that moment, everyone knew the truth. The German shepherd had unearthed not only an old cellar but the echoes of a tragedy that had haunted the town for decades. What lay hidden in the dark space was more than just forgotten belongings. It was the memory of a lost child, the weight of unanswered questions, and the proof that animals sometimes guard the truths humans fear to face. The whispers of memory filled the chamber, binding every person in the room to the story they had ignored for far too long. For a long moment, the cellar was filled with silence, thick, heavy, broken only by the crackling hiss of lantern flames. The townsfolk stood frozen, their eyes darting from the old shoes to the marks on the floor, to the shepherd who refused to move from his stance. Then it happened. A sound, so faint at first that most thought it was a trick of the wind, drifted up from the damp floorboards. It was soft, muffled, but unmistakable. A cry. Not human, not the echoes of memory, but a living sound, fragile and trembling. The shepherd's ears shot forward, his body snapping into motion. He barked sharply, the sound ricocheting through the chamber, his paws digging furiously at the floor. Dust flew as his claws scraped the old planks, desperate to reach the source of the faint whimper rising from below. The crowd gasped, exchanging startled looks. "Did you hear that?" the teacher whispered, clutching her shawl tight. It sounded like... Her voice broke, unable to finish. "It's alive," the farmer said firmly, his eyes wide. He dropped his lantern closer to the floor, crouching beside the shepherd. The dog growled impatiently, his eyes blazing as he tore at the boards, his chest heaving with every breath. The baby girl clung to her shepherd's back, her little voice trembling but certain. "There's someone down there," she whispered. Her innocence carried a weight that none could deny. The grandmother tapped her cane nervously, her lips trembling as she murmured a prayer. The faint cry came again, louder this time, carrying a fragile desperation that wrapped around every heart in the room. It was not the sound of ghosts. It was not memory. It was life, barely clinging, but life nonetheless. "Get the boards up," Officer Daniels barked, his flashlight beam steady on the spot where the shepherd dug relentlessly. "Now!" The farmer and two younger men leapt into action, slamming the crowbar into the planks. The wood groaned under the strain, splinters flying as the iron pried at the rotted edges. The shepherd growled beside them, barking furiously each time they paused, as if urging them to work faster. His claws never stopped, tearing into the cracks, his teeth even snapping at stubborn corners of the floorboards. He would not allow delay. The cries grew clearer, more desperate, and the crowd leaned forward, their fears slowly giving way to hope. The teacher covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling from her eyes. "Oh God, it's alive. Something's alive down there." With one final crack, a plank split open, revealing a gap beneath. Cold, damp air rushed out, carrying the scent of soil and confinement. Everyone held their breath as lantern lights spilled through the opening. The shepherd shoved his nose inside immediately, whining, barking, then pawing again. The sound from below answered, a faint, broken whimper that sent chills racing up every spine. "Widen it," the farmer shouted, his voice shaking. They swung the hammer, pried harder, with splintering and falling away. Piece by piece, the boards gave, until at last, the hole yawned wide enough for them to peer into the pit below. Gasps tore through the crowd. There, nestled in the damp earth, half buried under scraps of cloth and dust, was a tiny figure. A puppy. Weak, trembling, its fur matted and dirty, its ribs showing with every shallow breath. Its eyes blinked against the sudden light, wide and frightened, but alive. The shepherd howled, a long, mournful sound that shook the air. He lunged forward, trying to reach down, but the farmer caught his collar just in time. "Easy, boy, easy," he murmured, though his own hands shook violently. The little girl broke free from her grandmother's grasp, falling to her knees beside her shepherd. Her small hands reached toward the pit, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's just a baby," she cried softly. "Don't let him be alone." Officer Daniels lowered himself carefully, his flashlight clenched between his teeth as he reached into the hole. The puppy whimpered, too weak to move, its tiny body shivering in the cold. "I've got him," Daniels grunted, his arms straining as he scooped the fragile creature into his hands. When he lifted the puppy into the lantern light, the crowd gasped again, this time not in fear, but in awe. The frail body trembled violently, its whimpers barely audible, but its chest still rose and fell. It was alive. Against all odds, against the weight of time and darkness, it had survived. Tears broke freely then. The teacher sobbed into her shawl. The grandmother pressed her trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wet and glistening. The farmer wiped his brow, whispering, "Lord, forgive us. We almost ignored this." The shepherd pressed forward, whining, licking at the puppy as Daniels lowered it gently to the ground. His eyes shone with relief, his body relaxing for the first time that night. He circled the fragile life protectively, his tail low but wagging in cautious joy. The baby girl leaned close, wrapping her small arms around the shivering creature. Her voice was soft, full of love. "It's okay. You're safe now." The puppy whimpered once more, burying its tiny head against her dress, its body shaking but clinging to the warmth. The crowd stood in silence, their hearts caught between grief and wonder. The old shoes, the blanket, the marks on the floor, all spoke of tragedy, of stories lost to time. But here, in the arms of a child and under the guard of a faithful dog, was proof that life had endured. It was a miracle none could deny. And as the shepherd stood tall beside his girl, watching over the fragile puppy with eyes fierce and tender, the truth settled over everyone like a solemn vow. This dog had refused to be ignored because he knew what no one else could, that hope still lived in the shadows. The moment the frail puppy was lifted from the pit, the crowd moved as one. Fear had bound them together minutes ago, but now something else guided them. An urgency to protect the fragile life that had somehow endured in the darkness. A blanket was hurriedly torn from one of the lantern carriers, soft despite its age, and the trembling creature was wrapped carefully, its weak whimpers muffled against the fabric. The German shepherd stayed pressed close, pacing in tight circles, his nose brushing against the bundle every few seconds as if to reassure himself that the little one was still there. His tail wagged in hesitant flicks, but his eyes never softened. He was still on guard, unwilling to believe the danger had passed. Every time someone reached too quickly, he growled low, not in anger but in warning. This puppy was under his protection. The baby girl knelt beside him, her blue dress brushing against the cold floor as she leaned closer. Her small fingers reached out and stroked the trembling head of the rescued pup. For a moment, its wide eyes blinked open, and though faint, it let out a soft sigh. The girl's face lit up instantly, her lips curving into a smile that spread like light breaking through the storm. Her laughter, innocent and pure, filled the hidden chamber and broke the tension that had held everyone in silence. The townsfolk exchanged looks, their hearts pierced by the sight. For years, this cellar had represented only loss, grief, and unanswered questions. But now, in the fragile warmth of a child's embrace, there was hope. It was small, trembling, and weak, but it was alive, and that was enough. "Take it to the vet," Officer Daniels said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "Quickly, before it's too late." The farmer nodded, cradling the bundled puppy gently as though it were made of glass. He held it close to his chest, the lantern light bouncing off his tired, weathered face. "We'll get him safe," he promised. The shepherd followed immediately, his paws tapping against the stones, his eyes locked on the bundle, unwilling to let even a breath separate them. The girl trotted alongside, her hand always brushing against her dog's back, as though tethered to him by invisible string. When they emerged from the alley into the open night air, the town seemed changed. The mist still curled along the streets, the lanterns still flickered weakly, but there was a lightness that hadn't been there before. People walked not with fear but with urgency, their hearts stirred by something greater than the shadows they had just faced. At the veterinarian's small clinic near the edge of town, the doors were thrown open in haste. The vet, a kind-faced man with silver hair, rose from his desk in shock at the sight of the crowd pressing in. "What on earth?" he began, but then his eyes fell on the bundle in the farmer's arms, and he rushed forward without another word. They laid the puppy on a soft blanket as the vet worked quickly, checking its pulse, its breath, its frail frame. He rubbed its body with a warm cloth, his hands steady and practiced. "Malnourished. Weak," he muttered under his breath, "but alive." He reached for milk, guiding the fragile muzzle to the bottle. At first, the pup barely stirred, but then, with a trembling effort, it began to drink. The room exhaled in relief. The shepherd stood so close to the table that the vet had to gently push him back, though he never truly moved. His nose brushed the edge, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body trembling with protectiveness. The baby girl climbed onto a chair beside him, her tiny hand resting on his fur. Together, they watched the miracle unfold, the puppy drinking, shivering less, its breaths growing steadier with every passing minute. For the first time in years, the town felt something it had almost forgotten: renewal. Old griefs that had lingered in whispers and shadows began to shift, not erased but softened by the sight of life clinging on. Tears ran freely, tears of relief, of healing, of something unspoken that each person carried. The teacher wiped her eyes behind her shawl, whispering, "All these years, we thought only sorrow lived in that place." The grandmother leaned heavily on her cane, her voice breaking as she murmured, "And yet, even in sorrow, life waited." This dog knew. The little girl giggled suddenly as the puppy sneezed softly after drinking, its tiny nose twitching. The sound, small and silly, sent laughter bubbling through the room, breaking the heavy silence. Even the stern lines on Officer Daniel's face eased into a smile. The shepherd turned toward his girl at the sound of her laughter, his tail thumping softly against the floor. He leaned into her side, proud and protective, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The rescued puppy, though weak, curled into the blanket, its breathing steady now, its small body finally at rest. It let out a soft whimper, not of fear, but of comfort. The German shepherd lowered his head beside it, his nose touching the bundle, his eyes closing for the first time that night. The room was quiet again, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of hearts bound together by a miracle. In that tiny clinic, surrounded by trembling lantern light, the town realized that grief and hope could live side by side, that sometimes, from the deepest sorrow, a spark of life could still rise. And it had taken the cries of one faithful dog, a loyal companion, to show them. The following evening, the town gathered again at the place where it had all begun. The narrow alley that once carried only shadows and whispers now glowed softly with candlelight. One by one, people came, farmers with rough hands, teachers with tired eyes, mothers holding their children close, and elders leaning on canes. Each carried a small flame, trembling in the night air, yet strong enough to drive away the darkness that had clung to those walls for decades. The German shepherd stood near the gate where his howls had first pierced the silence. His posture was calm now, but his eyes remained sharp, as though still guarding against what had once hidden beneath the ground. The baby girl in her blue dress sat cross-legged beside him, the rescued puppy nestled safely in her lap. The shepherd's tail brushed against her gently, a quiet rhythm of comfort, while the puppy gave tiny yawns, its small body already stronger than the night before. People lit candles along the walls of the alley, placing them carefully on the uneven stones. Their warm glow spread in ripples, chasing away the damp shadows. For the first time, the alley felt less like a place of fear and more like a place of remembrance, where grief could finally be spoken out loud. The grandmother was the first to speak, her voice shaky but steady enough to carry. "I used to tell my children not to walk past here at night," she admitted, her eyes glistening in the flickering light. "I said it was cursed. But now I see, it wasn't cursed at all. It was waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. And it was the dog who showed us." The farmer nodded, his lantern casting shadows across his weathered face. "Animals know things we don't," he said quietly. "They see what our eyes ignore, feel what our hearts have forgotten. We thought he was just making noise, just a nuisance. But he was screaming for us to listen." His words lingered, heavy with the weight of regret. The teacher, usually composed, wiped her eyes and added, "I once read to my students about the loyalty of animals, how they guard, how they guide, how they sense danger when we cannot. Tonight we saw it with our own eyes. This shepherd reminded us that loyalty is not just a story in a book. It is alive, it breathes, and it saves." Candles continued to be placed until the entire alley shimmered with light. The flickering flames reflected in everyone's eyes, a mirror of their shared emotions, grief for the past, wonder at the present, and hope for the future. Children clutched their parents' hands tightly, while elders whispered prayers for those who had been lost, their voices carrying softly into the night air. The baby girl, too young to understand the full depth of what had happened, tilted her head back and whispered to her shepherd, "Good boy. You saved him." Her words, though simple, carried more weight than the longest speeches. The townsfolk smiled through their tears, realizing that sometimes innocence captured the truth better than wisdom ever could. The rescued puppy stirred in her lap, lifting its tiny head to nuzzle her chin. The crowd let out a collective sigh, hearts melting at the sight. It was as though the puppy itself understood the role it played, not just a survivor, but a symbol that life could grow even in places once ruled by sorrow. The policeman, his uniform still smelling faintly of the dust from the hidden cellar, cleared his throat. We often think of strength as something loud, commands, orders, the sound of boots on the ground. But last night, strength came from howls in the dark, from a dog that refused to be ignored. And because of him, we found not only a life, but the truth we had buried for too long. The grandmother leaned on her cane, her eyes misty as she whispered, "Sometimes animals scream for what humans cannot see. And sometimes it takes their cries to bring us back to what we should have never forgotten." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was filled with reflection, with the sound of the flames flickering, with the gentle breathing of the two dogs lying side by side. The townsfolk felt a closeness they had not felt in years. They were no longer strangers scattered by routine. They were a community bound by one dog's loyalty and one miracle's survival. The little girl stood, holding the puppy in her arms while the shepherd pressed close to her side. The three of them became a picture the townsfolk knew they would never forget. A child, innocent and unbroken, carrying hope in her arms. A puppy, fragile but alive, proof that even the darkest places could not extinguish life. And a shepherd, loyal and unshaken, who had screamed until the world finally listened. The people looked at them and saw not just animals and a child, but symbols of something greater: unity, courage, and the reminder that even the smallest voices could change everything. That night, as the last candles burned low and the crowd began to drift home, the alley no longer felt like a place to avoid. It had become sacred ground, where sorrow had turned to hope and where a dog's howls had united a town. And long after the flames faded, the memory of that night would continue to glow in their hearts. As the story comes to its close, one truth shines brighter than any candle that night. Sometimes it is not human voices that save us, but the cries of those who cannot speak our language. That German shepherd, loyal and unshaken, refused to give up until someone finally listened. His howls were not noise. They were warnings. They were love. They were proof that animals often carry wisdom our eyes overlook. And then there was the baby girl in her blue dress, too small to understand the weight of the moment, yet big enough in heart to trust her faithful companion. Her innocent laughter, holding that rescued puppy close, was the sound that healed a town heavy with grief. In her arms, the future seemed brighter. In her smile, old wounds softened. The rescued puppy, fragile but alive, became a symbol the whole community could cling to. From the darkness of the hidden cellar, life had risen again. It reminded everyone that even when history feels heavy, hope can still be found in the most unexpected places. The townsfolk had gathered, shared stories, and lit candles not just to honor what was uncovered, but to remind themselves that healing is possible when hearts come together. And it all began with a dog who refused to be ignored. Now I ask you, the one listening to this story, do you believe animals sense what humans cannot? Do you believe they carry instincts and loyalty that we too often take for granted? If this story touched your heart, if it made you pause and remember the quiet power of loyalty and love, then share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Because kindness is what keeps the world gentle. Loyalty is what keeps it safe. And innocence, the laughter of a child, the wag of a tail, the bark that refuses to fade, is what keeps hope alive. Before you go, I invite you to reflect on this story. Think about the times you may have ignored a cry, dismissed a warning, or overlooked a sign. Maybe this tale can be your reminder to listen a little closer, to animals, to children, to the small voices that often speak the loudest truths. And if this story moved you, I ask for something simple. Leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. Share your own story of a loyal animal or a moment where kindness surprised you. Let your words be part of the circle of healing this story began. And of course, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that remind us of what truly matters. Each tale is not just entertainment. It is a reminder that compassion still lives among us, waiting to be seen, waiting to be shared. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember the shepherd's howls echoing through the quiet town. Remember the baby girl's laughter and the fragile puppy's survival. And carry this truth with you. When loyalty meets innocence, when courage meets compassion, miracles can still be found, even in the darkest places.